Welcome. In this lecture of Political Science for class 11th, we would understand the real philosophy behind the Constitution. So far, we have understood why it is important to study Constitution per se, but at the same time, we also need to understand what is the criticism of the Constitution, what are the limitations of the Constitutions, along with the core features of the Constitution. If we go back to 1947 Japanese Constitution, it is called as a Constitution of Peace or a Peace Constitution. The real reason why it says so is in order to accomplish the high ideals for human relationships, it is said that it would never maintain any kind of land, sea or air force or for any war potential. The next important thing which has been mentioned under the Japanese Constitution says that people of Japan would forever renounce war as a sovereign right for the nation and would not move towards threat or use of force in order to settle any international disputes. So what is meant by the philosophy of Constitution when we focus on India? Now when we talk about India, we focus on the moral visions which are established. To understand that, we need to focus on the values, the morality. For example, a law would prohibit discrimination on the basis of language or religion. Now, such a law would be connected to which idea? The idea of equality. Now, this idea of equality is undertaken under the philosophy of Constitution, and therefore, we need to understand the basic structure of the Constitution, the rights, the citizenship, the concept of democracy, the concept of minority, equality, fraternity, justice, liberty. And this Constitution sets a vision for the society. Along with the vision, there is a set of ideals that are to be followed. So, we do have a political philosophical approach for Constitution. What is this political philosophical approach? That means we need to focus on moral values, evaluate whatever claims we are making, and then we need to interpret the core based on these political philosophical ideas. Indian Constitution must be ready along with the Constituent Assembly. So Indian Constitution must be read in conjunction with the Constituent Assembly, and that means the ideas which are challenged, discussed or debated across the various political fields should be interpreted. The various ways of interpretation and should be rightly checked, and any short-term interest should be taken into account. So, no conflict should be happening for this case. The next is Constitution, the democratic transformation that occurs in the Constitution. Now, modern states can exercise power. When I say modern states can exercise power, what does it imply? There can be monopoly, and with monopoly comes the force. Now, when there is force, what would happen? The power would go into a wrong hand, and when the power moves to a wrong hand, even the institutions that are created on the pillars of democracy can fail. So, we need to understand that the harm of the individual and the interests of the individual are not compromise. That means the individuals are not harmed, their interests are not harmed, and for that the basic rules need to be followed. So this Constitution provides you a set of basic rules. And what are those basic rules? These basic rules focus on freedom, equality and justice. That means the same example as we discussed before on discrimination could be well explained here. That means because of force you cannot discriminate between two segments of population based on religion, region, language, ethnicity or any other criteria. The one who is deprived must be empowered with certain additional benefits. Now this could be in the form of reservation, this could be in the form of protecting certain seats for them, deciding a quota or some other form. The persons who are deprived must be empowered, and that makes the Constitution democratic or creates the democracy. Now, when Constituent Assembly was on a move, Constituent Assembly was not just a group of people at that time. This Constituent Assembly was, along with a group of people, there were mainly lawyers who were part and parcel to it, and these lawyers had a vision to forecast or to see the future, not just the past and the present. And therefore Indian Constitution is unique because it has broken those shackles in which the Constitution was established years back. However, there are various other countries who still have a constitution which is in line with the things that had happened during the time of their country when the constitution was written, because they do not had the vision to forecast what could be the future if things are not brought in certain light. And empowering the deprived people aims for a collective good of the society. So bringing about collective good of the society is again important. And that's one of the major reasons why we refer to Constituent Assembly, and because of it, Constitution is still applicable. If we go back to countries like America, the Constitution was written in late 18th century, and in the present 21st century, the things have gone irrelevant. However, our Constitution, since it was with a vision, we did not just focus on the past and the present during that time, but the things that had been focused on are still relevant for the present. And therefore, we need to revisit the political philosophy of the Indian Constitution, which was greatly in the hands of some of the best lawyers of that time who were part to the writing of the Constitution. So what is the political philosophy? In the last slide, we said political philosophy. So what is the political philosophy? When all the ideals unfold on this play field, democracy is the real empire, and this is what we have understood across the concept. So philosophy is what? Philosophy is to have a federal structure with liberal democratic views, sensitization to various religious communities, to linguistic minorities, to disadvantaged groups, and to build a common identity on that platform. So in this section, we would focus on the 7 important pillars of political philosophy of Constitution, which are individual freedom, social justice, respect for diversity and minority, secularism, universal franchise, federalism, and national identity. So let's first talk about 3 of those: individual freedom, social justice, and minority rights. When I say individual freedom, Raja Ram Mohan Roy protested against the curtailment of the freedom to press rights, which were released by the British colonial states, and they said that in order to provide a right information, communication cannot be restricted, and therefore freedom of press should be mandatory. Now this led to unlimited publications or unlimited liberty of publications. Indian demanded a free press throughout the British rule, and finally the infamous act, which was one of the Rowlatt Acts, which was passed, the national movement opposed it, and that was the reason because it was denying the basic freedoms of individual. The next is the concept of social justice. Now, social justice talks about providing justice as well as focusing on community values of an individual. So here, let's say when you have the right to vote, giving you the real meaning to right to vote is what is extremely important, and therefore social justice comes into play. So government makes it possible to reserve public sector jobs for certain segment of the society. Reservation does comes up, and this aims to provide justice to all segments of the society. Similar to this is the respect for diversity and minority rights, where we say that it's not only just equality, but it is to provide the representation for those who are not getting equal level playing platforms, and also sometimes to recognize their rights. It becomes important. So when we focus on liberalism in Indian context, this liberalism comes in 2 streams. One began with Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and he emphasized the rights of individual, mainly the rights of women. The second stream was under K.C. Sen. It was under Swami Vivekanand, and this focused on the spirit of social justice within the orthodox segment of Hinduism. So it could not have been possible without the liberal frameworks. If those liberal frameworks were not brought, then that concept of orthodoxy would not have been curtailed. The next two important ones are secularism and universal franchise. Secularism says that freedom to religion for each and every individual. Now this would include right to religious groups. It would talk about state's power for intervention. Now, there are few things under secularism. The first is that our constitution reinforces and reinvents forms of liberal individualism. The second is our constitution upholds the principle of social justice without compromising the individual liberties. And third is, against the background of intercommunal strife, the constitution upholds its commitment to group rights. The next is the concept of universal franchise. So Motilal Nehru in 1928 reaffirmed the concept of citizenship and said that every person of any gender who has attained an age of 21 years would be eligible to vote under the House of Representation or the Parliament, despite of the fact that the person is male or female, man or women. Everyone would have the right to vote, and this was by the Motilal Nehru report in 1928. The next two important pillars are federalism and national identity. Article 370 talking about Jammu Kashmir, 371 talking about Northeast anticipate the concept of asymmetric federalism that exists in India. However, we have seen that there is a strong central government, there is also legal state, subunits, differentiation within subunits which is there, and therefore this federalism aims to just protect the local identity, but at the same time we also need to move forward for our national identity. So focusing on the concept of one community is important, and for this there are certain procedural achievements. One is that Indian Constitution reflects a faith in political deliberation. That means the groups and the interests were not the groups were not represented in the Constituent Assembly. The second is that it also explains the spirit of accommodation, compromise, which makes it extremely important to bring in more views within the vision. But there are certain criticisms to Constitution as well. Three important criticism is it is unwieldly, unrepresentative and alien to our conditions. Now, when I say unwieldly, it is based on the assumption that the entire constitution of the country must be found within one compact document. But that is not true even for a country like United States. How would it be true for a country like India? So therefore, it has been called as unwieldly. Unrepresentative because when the Constituent Assembly was formed, that Constituent Assembly, most of the members came from advanced section of the society, and therefore voice of the common or certain component was not properly represented, and therefore the question says whether our constitution is unrepresentative. However, this claim does not actually hold true, because when we focus on the pillars of equality, liberty, fraternity, we make sure that no one goes unrepresented. But that had been one of the questions, because when we are specifically targeting to preserve the interests of a segment of society, we need to understand that it should not be a case that some of the members of Constituent Assembly who were designing the constitution during that time belong to certain advanced strata of the society, and therefore the certain backward strata of the society was not represented. So that should not happen, and this had been questioned some of the times. The next is some of them say that our constitution is alien to us. Why? Because it has taken various excerpts from different nations and just tried to incorporate it in Indian settings. But understand, this is not a blind borrowing. It is actually an innovative borrowing which has happened. And if we focus on some of the studies, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his trend continues till now for his efforts on Dalit and modernization, introduction of a new legal system, bringing in lawsuits against the landlords, and then interaction of local culture with Western modernity, and how indigenous traditions were to be restored. However, there are certain limitations of the constitution. Indian constitution has a centralized idea for national unity, and that sometimes is a questionable case when we are focusing on fragments or subunits of a region. Also, it appears to be glossed over some important issues, for example, gender justice, particularly within the family. Those issues are not properly addressed, and definitely, and therefore is one of the reasons we call constitution as a living document, because there is a scope for amendment and new modifications and changes can be brought within the ambit of constitution. The fact that they still do not hold within the purview, those could be incorporated later. And it is not clear why in a developing nation certain basic socio-economic rights were relegated to the sections of directive principle rather than making them the part of fundamental rights. So why some of the things fall under the purview of DPSPs or directive principles of state policy and not the fundamental rights is again a big question. So those are some of the questions that have been raised onto the constitution. But despite of all these, Indian constitution, as we said, has an innovative borrowing and not a blind borrowing, and focuses on the ideas and the pillars of equality, fraternity, secular nation, liberty, justice, and therefore make sure that everyone gets a right representation, the minorities are right represented, also the segments of the society, mainly gender issues, are properly addressed, and these 7 pillars of political philosophy of constitution does not remain untouched. That is, ensuring that every individual has a freedom, making sure social justice is for all, there is respect for the rights of minority and the rights for diversity, making India a secular nation, maintaining India a secular nation, focusing on the rule and the concept of universal franchise, talking about federalism and federalist structure for easy governance across India, and the idea of national identity. So these are the 7 most important political philosophies. However, we have already discussed the concepts of the core of Indian philosophy, the values behind Indian philosophy, Indian constitutional philosophy, but at the same time we have already also understood some of the criticisms and the limitations of the constitution, but the political philosophy does surpass those limitations and those criticisms. So that was about this lecture. We will be covering the complete NCERT tutorials on the channel Examrace YouTube. Stay subscribed. Have a wonderful day ahead.